status from any organisation that funds or engages in political activity. Without any further ado, I'd like to call upon the first speaker of the affirmative, Luke.
Let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, elections primarily within America are all about money. They're all about your ability to collect funds, to use those to disseminate your message to a wider group of people. But it's not just campaigns and individuals that contribute to this massive amount of money that we need. We also think that groups who are using tax-exempt status, primarily groups like religious groups, churches, or even charitable organisations, that are using their tax-exempt status to maintain a large amount of money and use it to influence political elections, we think that is incredibly unfair. We're not happy to stand by it on the affirmative team tonight. So what's our model? And it's fairly straightforward. We think that any institution, be it political, religious, charitable, business, any group that wants to influence or directly fund a campaign election through ads, through donation, or through disseminating flyers or anything like that, should be forced to pay tax equivalent to how much money they're earning. We think that's straightforward. What we think this does is forces those groups to choose between what role they want to play, if they want to play a purely religious role and disseminate, say, religion to the people, or whether or not they actually want to get involved in the election campaigns and ensure and try and influence it in that way. I have 3 points. I want to firstly look at why we grant tax-exempt status and why it no longer applies to these groups. Secondly, I want to look at the role that this money plays, why this tax exemption actually gives these groups an unfair advantage, why it should end. Finally, I want to look at how it undermines the aims of non-profits and what non-profit groups and why we don't think that tax-exempt status in combination with donations is necessarily a fair way to go. So, when do we grant tax-exempt status? Because the idea of tax exemption was originally to ensure, or tax exemption, just like when we donate taxpayer money to any specific group, is to ensure there is a social good coming from the use of money or the non-collection of that money. We think those are fairly similar ideas. That when we grant tax-exempt status to religious groups, to ensure that that religious group or individuals within society could engage with that faith if they felt it was necessary. That they could engage with a charity if they felt it was necessary and felt that that was the best use of their money and of their time. We ensure that those institutions were necessarily able to continue existing because they didn't have the burden of tax, but they didn't have the money to necessarily stay up and stay afloat without it. We don't think this is necessarily the case. We think large religious organisations within America at the moment have high levels of income from the people that engage with that religion. We don't think they necessarily need tax-exempt status to maintain those goods that come from having a religious organisation. We don't think they need tax-exempt status to ensure they can provide religion and engagement to that religion to the people. We're happy to stand by that. But even principally, we think it's really important to ensure that when you are granting tax-exempt status to a group or to an institution or to an organisation, that tax-exempt status is for general public good. We don't think the ability for you to influence an election, the ability for you to push one particular ideology, and primarily, a lot of the time, it comes with right-wing ideologies, things like anti-abortion, things like getting rid of evolution and teaching that in school. We think that those kind of things, those kind of messages are not what the public necessarily supports on the whole. We don't think that public money or a non-collection of public money should be going to those messages. But secondly, I want to look at this idea of what the money actually does in these elections, and what role money actually plays. Because what we think is that when Obama in 2008 raised $454 million, when McCain raised $377 million, and when Obama's target for the upcoming election is $1 billion, we think money is how you actually run a campaign, how you actually start to get that success within that campaign. But how is it? Because you need the money to ensure that you can disseminate your message or your point of view to a larger group of individuals. Through leaflets, through billboards, through phone lines, through actually transporting people to propose your message to individuals. What we think happens is that when you have a tax-exempt group, a tax-exempt institution, such as like the Catholic Church, or such as any religious organisation within America, they get to use all of their money for those same purposes. you get to ensure that all of your money, that all of the funds that you are collecting can go towards and purporting your message to the wider American public. But we think that that's necessarily providing an unfair advantage on these groups. For every member that your group has, for every dollar that your group collects, you have a 20 or 30% more higher cut that can go towards funding your message. You have a larger amount of that money that can ensure that your message gets to a larger group of people. We don't think that's necessarily fair. What we support on the Affirmative Summit today is that if you want to engage in that political system, you should be on an equal playing field to any other member who wants to engage in that political system, be it a business, be it an individual. I think that's incredibly important because we don't think it's fair to necessarily say that one group should have a greater advantage to influence that, influence an election, influence financing campaigns, just because we think that the idea of, say, providing religion or engagement to that religion to the individuals on the ground is necessarily a good thing. We want to ensure that we're bringing in the aims of where taxpayer money should be collected and where it shouldn't be collected, in line with our aims of ensuring that when you're competing within the political system, you're getting a fair playing field. You're ensuring that any side can actually engage in the playing field fairly and ensure that they have the ability to win, the ability to ensure and actually get their message across. So we think that in terms of taking money and not taking money from religious organisations or people who have tax-exempt status, we think that's fairly straightforward and gives them an unfair advantage. But finally, we think what actually happens at the moment, on my final point, it undermines the aims of these kind of groups. Because what happens is that when you can claim tax-exempt status, that sends a message out to individuals who want to engage with that group, that you're not necessarily engaging in, that you're necessarily purporting a public good, that you're not necessarily ensuring that you're not necessarily trying to take a specific slant. So for example, if a charity wanted to donate to the political system, to donate to a specific message, what we think it does is that they take the money that individuals have donated to that group for a public good, so feed the poor, or save the animals, or save the whales, or whatever. We think that what happens then is that money necessarily starts to move away from the areas that they're necessarily pushing it towards. And we think that when people already have a lot of skepticism when they're donating to charities or tax-exempt groups at the moment as to where that money is actually being spent, whether or not it's going to administrative overheads, whether or not it's going to the salaries of the people occupying that group, we think this just simply fuels that confusion and fuels that discontent. Because when this tax-exempt group can necessarily say, well, we're collecting money for a public good, we're collecting money to ensure that we're achieving our aims of, let's say, housing people, and they can start pushing that money towards funding one particular side in a debate, one particular side in an election. We don't think that's necessarily a good use or a good line of accountability for that money, where it's going and how it should be spent. But furthermore, we think that when it comes down to it, when it comes down to ensuring that you're getting your message across in an election, it should be fair to say that you have, you're paying tax money back into the government, back into the system. We want to ensure that if you're coming down and involving yourself in a political election, you're registering yourself as an institution who is primarily engaging in that campaign. So what we actually want to do is make it very clear that this particular organisation is tax exempt and it's not engaging in a political contribution. It's not necessarily funding elections, or it is, and it's paying tax, and it's very clear to individuals that if you're donating money there or you're spending time with that group, you're necessarily going to be influencing an election. At the end of the debate, at the end of my speech, I'm going to make it very clear. If you're going to influence an election, if you're going to run and push money towards spreading a specific message, you should be paying tax like every other group, like every other organisation, like every other business. I think it's very important to realise that the unfair advantage that institutes tax and status groups at the moment is not in line with wider grant tax exemption we're happy to propose.
Alright, thank Luke for his speech. I'd like to welcome the first speaker from the negative team, Harry.
Mr. Speaker, the stance coming from negative is simple: removing tax-exempt status from these organizations harms democracy and society, and will deal with 5 values that is benefited from granting this status to these organizations in the first place: freedom of speech, independence, social services, representation, and fairness. And we'll show you how those values are best served by granting tax-exempt status to these organizations. My substantive will be twofold. Firstly, I'll show you what I'll deal with better characterization of why tax exemptions exist, right? I'll show you why they're more important for these organizations, given that side affirmative here wants you to believe that it's only large religious organizations that benefit from it. We'll show you how this disproportionately harms small religious organizations as well as charities in the end. Because he conveniently talked about these religious organizations without really giving the whole scope of what kind of organization would be affected in the end. I'll deal with first speech in three parts. Firstly, I'll deal with the assumption that reducing the tax or taking away the tax exempt status will lead to less influence. Secondly, is this idea that more money equals candidates winning, because that was the assertion that they had, that because you have more money, you're necessarily influencing these campaigns. But third of all, how by removing the status from tax exempt status from these organizations will mean that they'll put more money into social services. We think that's highly unrealistic, given today that organizations need to both engage with the public and also engage with government at the same time. How do you best deal with those two parties? Let's first deal with, let me quickly deal with his quick mechanism that you would tax equivalently income. We're not entirely sure what he means by the amount of tax you would impose on these organizations. Would it be similar to corporate tax, Mr. Speaker? Because we think that the huge amount of corporate tax we impose on corporations would disproportionately affect charities, given that they don't exactly sell products in order to make their money at the same rate as these corporations currently do, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah.
So let's move on to this first rebuttal I have about how reducing tax equals less influence, Mr. Speaker. We think that we should acknowledge that influencing isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's part of how America recognizes that lobbying represents an extension of the freedom of speech. They should be able to convince people to vote for you, Mr. Speaker, to take your interests into account, and that's why lobbying is a constitutionally protected right. We do, however, mitigate the harms of lobbying under status quo by making sure that we have transparency in terms of donors, Mr. Speaker. We mitigate the influence by making sure that the voters know exactly who is voting or who is funding these candidates in the first place. So we don't think necessarily that what they're going to do is reduce the influence. It might reduce the influence, but we think that's necessarily harmful. But second of all is this assertion that more money equals influence or equals winning the speaker. We don't think that's quite true. If you look at the example of previous millionaire candidates such as Steve Forbes and Mitt Romney, they haven't exactly been very successful in the American electoral landscape, Mr. Speaker. Money does not necessarily equal winning, and we don't think that we don't think that the problem that necessarily exists. But last of all is their assumption that removing this tax exempt status would mean that they'll put money into social services. We don't think so, Mr. Speaker, because this is part of why it's so important, right? Realistically, right, for charities or non-governmental organizations to be effective today in the public, they need to both raise awareness within the public, i.e. campaigns, but also they need to engage with government in order to convince them. And the most effective way for them to do this is through campaign finance, through funding candidates who they believe would best serve their interests, Mr. Speaker. And we think it's fundamental for them to achieve their own goals towards serving society, that they engage with government by funding candidates who would fight for example, conservation, Mr. Speaker. And we think it's far better here that we allow these organizations to deal with both at the same time. We think it's also important for them to acknowledge that corporations right now have a lot more power compared to non-governmental organizations, how it would be highly unfair for you to now impose this burden on these organizations themselves. We think he did mention a bit why tax exemptions exist, right? But he ignores the fact that tax exemptions currently exist to aid and empower organizations whose work in society overlap with governments, Mr. Speaker. That means that these organizations already provide welfare and counseling to minority groups of people who fall between the cracks of government service, like, for example, religious groups, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, also NGOs raise awareness, they make research, they enter research, and they also monitor people corporations who might reach environmental organizations. So, for example, NGOs such as the WWF, the Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, all these NGOs do things that government cannot do or is failing to do, and that's why government gives these organizations tax exempt status. So what you're now doing is you're recognizing that government doesn't have the ability to do all these things. You're now reducing these NGOs' ability to do all these things as well. You're reducing the ability of us to achieve those social goods, Mr. Speaker. So why is it so important for us to have tax exempt status, or what would be the harms of taking it away? Why is it so important right now? Is that it enables them to carry out more social services by reducing taxes, but secondly by also reducing the overhead to comply with these tax taxes in the first place. If that concern so much is how these organizations spend their money, Status Quo already requires these organizations to be audited yearly to maintain their standards, to prevent embezzling, Mr. Speaker. This includes things such as, releasing your financial records to the IRS, those kind of things. So if that's a concern about how these organizations are using the money, Status Quo already covers that, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, this is very important, it empowers these groups to speak out. Raising awareness and informing the public is complemented by pressuring government to recognize, to enact policies that recognize their interests. Which is why you see Audubon Society and Sierra Club funding more and more candidates who fight conservation in California, Mr. Speaker. What would be the harm of removing these tax exemptions? First of all, recognizing that organizations right now have to deal with two aims at the same time. What they'll be doing is actually reducing the ability of these organizations to serve society, because they'll have to put money into funding campaign candidates anyway, Mr. Speaker. They'll simply take away money, or it's likely that they'll take away money from their social service in order to fund these candidates to better push for their policies, Mr. Speaker. Or what this will do is reduce their ability to affect government to push policies that will be favoring them, Mr. Speaker. And we think that's highly problematic. But second of all, what it does is it reduces representation by these minority groups, because a lot of minority groups, like religious groups, Mr. Speaker, or conservationists rely on these NGOs to fight for their interests in government. What this also does is makes these groups more vulnerable to corporate interests, because now they'll have to look for funding elsewhere to be able to serve both society and government at the same time. And what this does is it makes them vulnerable to being co-opted by interests that you're not necessarily aware of, Mr. Speaker. What this does is it reduces the independence of these organizations to remain free of other interests besides just their donors. What have we shown to you from side negative, Mr. Speaker? We've shown to you that the problem doesn't really, that the problem that they're trying to solve won't be solved with a proposal, but we think the problem is currently being dealt by Status Quo anyway. What we've shown to you from side affirmative is that values such as freedom of speech, such as independence, such as social services and representation will be greatly harmed by removing tax exempt status from these organizations in the first place. What we've shown to you from side negative is that it's very important for these organizations, that it's very realistic now for us to expect that these organizations both need to provide social services as well as being able to fund candidates who will fight for policies that favor them. For those reasons, we're proud to negate.
I thank Tarek for his speech, and I'd like to continue to negate Bernardin's case. I welcome to.
You need this.
That would be my sister. Ladies and gentlemen, we live under a status quo where small charities already do donate to political candidates. One of the best examples is a non-profit anti-abortion organisation created by the Palins in the US, an organisation that itself donates over 90% of its profits to those political candidates instead of putting it into the issues and the areas that it should be. Those areas like anti-abortion stuff, the money that was actually given to them to support. We see under the status quo there is no incentive against these organisations being created for non-political reasons and being put these monies there. We said that people don't have the knowledge that these organisations are purely political. We don't have the message that this is being taxed, that your money will be less effective when it's being sent in. So we actually discourage this sort of political donations. Ladies and gentlemen, we never got any analysis from the other side why individual non-for-profit groups, just because of the fact that they're non-profit or religious or believe in the ways, should have more ability to be able to influence opinions and the actions of government and legislation and to use as an arm of individual political groups to support their own industries. just because they're not political. We think that under the status quo, it should be the case that all groups are considered equal, that just because you're religious, just because you support Jesus, doesn't mean you should have a greater ability to be able to influence these events. I'm going to talk about how government support for non-profits impedes the process of actually allowing these people to achieve their aims. But before I do that, I've got a couple of pieces of rebuttal. One, freedom of speech isn't important. So they said that you should be able to lobby under the status quo, because freedom of speech is very important and be able to talk your ideas. One, we say that yes, that is, but that freedom of speech just because you support the whales or that you support any other anti-abortion group should not be different just for the fact that you are a charity or non-profit. Furthermore, you said if you want to push your advertising, you can do it on your specific issue. You can still run advertising about Save the Whales. What you shouldn't be doing is pushing individual candidates and saying this person is good, influencing all the other areas that these things stand for, away from the whales, like anti-abortion, all those other politics, just because you're pushing it individually. We said that these lobby groups should always be standing for the individual things that they're standing for and not converting the political system. They said that it isn't a big problem anyway because we have transparency, right? What is transparency in the US, right? You just have a piece of paper that says this group donated to this other organisation. There's no limits about what that money was used for. There's no agreement about what agreement you made for that money to be used for and what things are being pushing. Because the transparency doesn't exist for these groups. When this transparency doesn't exist, we need to ensure that there's at least a legal playing field on the donation of money. Secondly, it's harm to small charities. They said that it's really bad because this will be really costly to small charities. We say, fine, right? Like, we don't think small charities that have very limited funds to be able to be put towards their money should be incentivized to be trying to go through the political process to be able to get like donations from other groups and stuff like that. Why should we be incentivizing small charities to using money with the examples where the Palin's anti-abortion non-profit is giving like 90% of its money towards donations because they believe that there is a profit and there is an incentive for you to do it. We think that when you have the disincentive of tax, when you have to make that choice between donating this money or being taxed, that's when you ensure that these services are being used for these other groups. So, finally, on whether money equals winning. And we say that if money doesn't equal winning, we don't know why they're so big on these individuals being able to actually donate monies to individual funds and individual organisations. We say because apparently Mitt Romney isn't a millionaire and money isn't everything. We say Mitt Romney is a millionaire, but the cost of this election is going upwards towards billions of dollars, right? The ability to influence and the ability to have more money individually for your individual vote to influence that person even more because you can donate more because you're not being taxed on it because you have zero overheads is more costly. When you can do advertising, when you can fund attack ads, when you can put out flyers, when you can stand on a pew as a religious organisation and tell your congregation of thousands of people which you've been able to build up because you don't have to pay for land, that's problematic, right? That's when you have advantages over all these other groups. Money is an issue in this thing. Money is power. That's why Citizens United ruling said that money is free speech. Necessarily is an issue when you have more money in these groups. So, what am I going to be talking about today, my substantive? I'm going to talk about how government support for non-profits perverts the process of support for individual charities and how it creates an arms race to ensure that more and more money is being taken away from aims and actually spent on things like advertising. So, government support for non-profits. So, under the status quo, non-profits at the moment, if not totally, what we want is a situation where non-profits are basically non-political. So what happens under the status quo when you allow non-profits in the political system to actually be able to support candidates, to be able to put their money, to put their own resources, to put their advertising towards supporting these candidates? We see it's similar to what happens in the American context with organisations and PACs. You don't just give money to these groups because you think they're nice and you're not going to get anything in return. You give money towards these groups because you have the ability to influence their opinions when they call up. You give money to these groups because when your government gets into control, they can give you preferential treatment. How do we think this influences the ability of these organisations, small or big, to be able to do their job? Because we think when it comes to provision of grant money, as we often see, when governments give money to individual political groups to do a social good, you pervert the process. Like, as much as you can spit proposals about what you want to achieve and what you're wanting to do, the decision is no longer on whether or not you're a good organisation and what you're doing is getting social group. It is on whether you gave money to that organisation, whether or not you made a deal at this point, that if we give you money and we give you advertising, we will give you a grant in return for you to be able to do this. So, one, if your party wins, you get preferential treatment. It means that the decision isn't made based on your ability to give services, based on the ability to get most social group as a non-profit. It is because your organisation or the organisation will get preferential treatment because you advertise. Or otherwise, your party loses. and you have invested millions upon millions of dollars from your own group towards this political group, and you get nothing. The other people get looked over because the other group put more towards the political group. Why is this problematic? This is what I'm talking about second substantive. It forces support and an arms race for political groups. Because if you don't engage with the political system under the status quo, there is only a cost. That cost is that you're not being able to actually influence these individual political groups towards being able to get support. We say that when you implement taxes and when you ensure there are taxes for you actually engaging in the political process, it makes you a decision. And where it is whether or not you want to be completely political and go after these groups, or whether or not you're going to spend these money actually giving out social services. We say that it makes a negative choice, because when you incentivize people to be able to invest money with no pure repercussions, you get spending money and lobbying increasingly and increasingly more, because you have to outcompete all those individual groups that you're against to be able to get the provision of services. You have to spend more than an anti-abortion lobby if you're a pro-abortion lobby to be able to get support in government. We say that becomes even more problematic for the provision of services and how you actually get money. We say if it really comes down to it, we still agree that if you're an anti-abortion or abortion group or religious group, you should be able to lobby to be able to get these changes. You should be able to get the support. But you should lose, one, your tax exempt status so that you can actually be able to get these government supports and grants and actually be able to more efficiently be able to actually implement these groups. But more importantly, you shouldn't be making that choice between taking the money that you get in income and increasingly put it towards advertising, towards attack ads, before ensuring that person gets the government. Instead, you're putting in the things that you're supposed to be doing as a non-profit, which is investing in people, investing in social groups, setting up programs so you can actually do the things that you're aiming for, and maybe even just putting in general ads that you're going to do for protecting the world. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that non-profit groups necessarily should have a greater vote, and they should not have a greater vote than any other group just because you have a certain belief or just because you believe. We have considered you to be non-profit. In the end, we think that you should, in any cases, incentivize people to be apolitical, who can get social good for society and for the good of democracy.
I think second and third for speech. I'd like to welcome the second speaker from UTMARA 1, Shatik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. It's really early to be on drugs, and I can't believe why affirmative is on them at this early. Because they said that what they're going to achieve is achieving an equal playing field, which we think won't occur. We think an equal playing field will be effective under the negatives case, and I'll show you why in my speech. I'm going to talk about two things in my substantive. Firstly, I'm going to tell you why our proposal creates a counterbalance to state capture by MNCs or large corporations. But secondly, I'm going to talk to you about how this will send the message that government is deliberately shutting down voices of the people, and especially minorities, ladies and gentlemen, and why this is harmful. But before I move on to those ideas, I would like to deal with the speaker before me, right? He first talked about how, it is okay for them to shut, they're not actually shutting down freedom of speech. Well, they are, ladies and gentlemen. They gave us an analysis on how, these organizations can do it through other means, such as advertising and things like that. Firstly, we think that they can do it through advertising. It's not mutually exclusive. But why are you taking away their opportunity or right to be involved in government and influence government changes, ladies and gentlemen? We think, advertising and things like that are in the public level. We need some form of, government backing in terms of this, to make all this public advertising to be effective on the people. So if you do one over the other, the one on advertising on the public level won't be as effective as it would be if you have government backing through our proposal. But secondly, he said that transparency doesn't exist under status quo. We think it does. And my first speaker clearly told you this kind of regulations that already exist under status quo, where there will be an audit under audit on how do you spend your money and what kind of organization sponsors which candidate, ladies and gentlemen. All this information are available to the public, and this is how public can make informed choices on how they want to vote, right? We think all giving reports on your financial statement to the IRS and things like that already exists under status quo. So we clearly think that transparency and a form of check and balance already exists under status quo. And then thirdly, he said that it's good for us to disincentivize small charities from doing so, because now they can be able to focus their things on public work, right? We don't think it's good at all, ladies and gentlemen, because you're shutting down free speech on these people, right? Because you're shutting down their voices to be heard on the governmental level, to influence government policy, to care about these people. What does this do? When you shut down their speech and not making them involved in government, right? What they do is they go through other alternatives, ladies and gentlemen. They might get other MNCs to fund them, ladies and gentlemen, so that they will be able to influence government, right? They might be more radical because they don't have freedom of speech to be involved in the government. You can see how this anti-abortion group go at really extreme measures when their speech is shut down. They go to an extent where they burn abortion clinics or harm abortion doctors, ladies and gentlemen. This is the harm of suppressing speech, because you are not killing their thought and their ideal, because those thoughts and ideals still exist and they might find alternative way to let it out. Lastly, he talked about how money equals winning elections. We don't think money is the only source of power. It's very simplistic of them to say that if you have money, you will definitely win election. We think there are many other factors, such as charisma and how you convince people on what are the policies that you will be fighting for. We think all these other sources of power is also as important as money, right? So we don't think that particular factor will influence or lead to a candidate winning an election. Next, he talked about how he also talked about how non-profit organizations can't be political. We don't think so. We think that non-profit organizations can be political. As I told you, why is it important for them to be involved in the government, to make their voices heard and shape government policies to lead to their social good? Because we think that when they are involved in the government, all their social work will be facilitated by government backing, and this is important because all their social work will be more effective, ladies and gentlemen, and that is what we're fighting for on the side of opposition. Lastly, he talked about how the small charities do not have enough money to fund these political candidates, and it will neglect their social work on the ground. We think although they don't, and they further said that because they have not enough money, they won't be able to influence this government more effectively. We think it's better for you to allow this opportunity, however much they want to put in the political candidate, because it's better off than disallowing them to do it altogether. Because at least our side is providing them an opportunity to express their freedom of speech and their ideals to the government. What they're doing is they're taking that away altogether because they believe that the money is too small and won't be effective in influencing at all. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how side negative creates a counterbalance to state capture by MNC or large corporations, and how our proposal will create a level playing field. In the context of state capture, ladies and gentlemen, and the corporations that lobby in Congress, these corporations that we're talking about are like big tobacco or big pharmaceuticals, which are wealthy and doesn't necessarily represent the interests of their people. They represent their self-interest and their organization's interest, ladies and gentlemen. When we're talking about NGOs or charities or religious organizations, these charity-based organizations or NGOs are not as wealthy as this MNC, but they actually do represent the interest of the people or society at large, ladies and gentlemen. If tax exemption status is removed, you disincentivize these organizations from engaging or funding political activities because of their nature of financial capacity being not as strong as MNCs and corporations. What this does is that it shuts down the voices of certain segments within society that these NGOs represent, ladies and gentlemen. And we think it will disincentivize them from participating further in the political process. This shifts the power away from the people people to large corporations that represent their own self-interest, ladies and gentlemen. So we think the shifting of power to large corporations and not the people is something that is harmful, that needs a counterbalance through this organization that actually represents the people. Democracy is about the power of the people, and they're taking that away from the people. And we don't think, they're only empowering the rich MNCs and corporations while disempowering small charity groups that are not as wealthy as these MNCs. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why it sends a message that government is deliberately shutting down voices of the people, which they are actually, ladies and gentlemen. As a consequence of this message that they are sending to the people, it will make it hard for government to receive cooperations with these NGOs or small charities. And it is important to recognize that government's cooperations with these NGOs or small charities is important for government to achieve national interest, right? When government, for example, are fighting for more environmental regulation, or fighting for more awareness within the public about conserving the environment, for example, ladies and gentlemen, what government needs are these organizations to be on the ground, creating awareness within their people. When you send the message that it's okay, or the government is deliberately shutting them down, corporations will not want to cooperate with this government because they feel isolated and marginalized. This will lead to them going to other alternatives or more extreme measures, ladies and gentlemen, to make their voices heard. For all those reasons and more, we are very proud to negate.
I thank the second negative for speech and conclude the standing portion of the third team. I welcome Ash.
Oh, Daisy. Mr. Speaker, if the negative are concerned about these NGOs and charities with religious abilities to influence the debate, then they had the wrong way of tackling it. What happens when money that Greenpeace gave to a candidate is not used to advertise about saving the whales, but is used to hire more volunteers or to bus those volunteers around the country? I think there is a serious risk about this money being misdirected. You can't control where your money goes once you've given up ownership of that. We think that they're not going to achieve the aims they wanted to under the model they presented from the other side of the house. So, 3 questions at the end of this debate. Firstly, what harms are going to come to these groups if tax-exempt status is removed? Second, what influence do these groups have in the political sphere, and how does that change under the negatives case? And lastly, how does this affect the relationship between government and these particular groups that we're talking about? So, what harms will come to these groups if we decide to remove tax-exempt status? The biggest one that's been pointed to by the negative is they're very concerned that these groups are going to be more vulnerable to corporate interests as the only way to be able to get those money. So, we absolutely disagree with this, so like, surprise, surprise. Why is that? Because we think these corporations probably have other methods to which they're going to fund elections, and probably not that interested. Like, Big Tobacco's not about to go, hey, Greenpeace have $1 million. We don't think that this relationship exists between these institutions. But even if we actually did, we don't see that like a religious group or a charity's membership, like they would actually know where that money was coming from and whether or not that would directly be used to fund those elections. We're concerned, if you want to be worried about whether or not corporate interests are going to come into play in groups like WWF or like Meals on Wheels or anything like that. We think you probably become more like a corporation, redirect those interests when you become more like those corporations when you direct them specifically to looking at politics, when you're trying to make sure they can be involved in the political sphere in the way that they want to, as opposed to prioritising the social good. Clearly their priority is for Greenpeace or WWF to be getting up in the face of whichever candidate they think is going to represent them, not dealing with the people power, which is where their power actually comes from, and dealing with their congregation or their supporters. So we think that that's the real risk in this situation. They get it redirected away from what the actual social good and the reason you had tax status was in the first place. Let's look at this second question. What influence do these groups have in the political sphere? So we believe that the money is the influence that they are able to have. We're told from the opposite side of the house that money doesn't equal success. Firstly, we absolutely dispute this. The average Senate incumbent has raised $8.3 million while they're sitting in power, and any challenger has like under $1 million at $8,500. I think that's an advantage of 10 to 1. That is very clear. That kind of money that can be raised can greatly influence your ability to run in an election and to be able to win that election. Even if that wasn't true, let's take them with their best and say that money has no influence on this. And the other factors they want to point to, like charisma, have involved. Well, we think that's a big problem as well. Well, because something like an evangelical group absolutely has that charismatic situation. A preacher getting in front of 1,000 people has that charismatic factor. And that means, under their logic, they should be able to spread their message on that basis. They should be having to get involved in the political sphere to this extent. So, what does money actually do when you're talking about it in a political sense? It gives you a greater ability to disseminate that message over any opponent that you have. So flyers, on ads, on attack ads, on volunteers, on hiring more staff. Those are all distinct advantages you can get over that. And that's not why these particular groups gave you that money. They didn't give you money so you could run another attack ad against your opponent. They gave you money so that way you could advertise whatever it is they support. We think often that's not necessarily the way in which this money is being used, which is really a big problem. Because the reason we gave these groups tax exempt status in the first place is we recognise they gave a social good to the community. We don't think that social good is being served when the money the WWF gave to Sarah Palin is being used to advertise anti-abortion. We think the money can easily be misdirected because the transparency they wanted to talk about, yes, it does extend to an audit, but it doesn't extend to what happens to that money once you've handed it over and how it's used. It only extends to the point of being an audit. And even if, like, people who are audited the IRS knows where that money went to, we think your donors probably have got no idea where that money actually went. Why is that? Because donors don't have records to IRS records, surprise, surprise, right? Like, they also probably don't know how to access anywhere where these files or issues would be kept. So that means those people don't have any idea what their money is being used for. That's a really big risk when you're relying on these individuals to continue to give you money in order to raise those particular finances. So, last question. How does this affect the relationship between the government and these kinds of groups, the charitable groups, the general organisations that provide the social good? They were concerned on the negative that would shut down free speech of these groups and there'd be a negative relationship to have between the government and between these groups. We don't think this is shutting down of free speech. Why is that? Because they can still direct money if they really want to. They would just have a lesser pool to do it. We don't think that's where they should be doing it, but should they want to, they do really want to deprioritise their original aims, I suppose they can do that, but that's not the point of those groups. But even more so, say they actually do take the high moral ground, and they continue to focus whatever their cause is, be it the whales, be it the trees, be it feeding the homeless. We think it means we're not funding money directly into a particular candidate, be it Mitt Romney, be it Sarah Palin, be it the local mayor. That means you can actually focus more on your own cause. That means you can actually focus on giving more meals to those homeless people in the district that you're trying to address. It means you can actually directly advertise on saving the Amazon if that is your cause. It means your money is not misdirected. It means you have control over your own funds. Be it less of those funds, they're actually being used. The marginal cost of a dollar is much more valuable. We can actually make sure it's being used for what you intended it to be used for, as opposed to someone else's aims. Especially when those aims may not directly line up with yours, but used for other things that you didn't necessarily intend for them to be used for. If that candidate supports alternate things your group might not otherwise support if you were given that option. We think that's a really big concern. We were told that there would be like incentives for these groups to act out in other ways so they couldn't have free speech. The examples that we got was things like anti-abortion groups going around and burning down clinics. Like, we already have a provision for that, it's called the law. If you go and burn down a clinic or you kill a doctor, I'm pretty sure the law can deal with that, arrest you and jail time. So we think that that's a ridiculous way of characterising these groups. We think what happens under their incentive, if you don't have tax exempt status, means you put the money into things you're supposed to be putting money for the first place, so because they still can advertise the things they wanted to. They just can't do it through a candidate. They do it through their own volunteers, giving their own time, and directly helping those people out. They were concerned that you're going to get alternate funding towards these groups, and they thought that was going to be a negative. We're fine with that, we'll tax that income too, if they do manage to get that. So we don't think there's all that much of a big risk. So, at the end of this debate, the affirmative team had two very clear problems: allowing charity groups or religious groups or general for the social good organisations continuing to have tax exempt status. That was that we felt it provided these groups with a greater pool of money to be able to influence proportionally the political sphere, and that necessarily that wasn't even the influence that they were trying to get. Secondly, we felt it undermined the aims of those groups in the first place and the goals of those organisations that were originally granted tax exempt status for. We think that's a really big problem. We're not happy to stand by that. We absolutely think these groups should focus on their original aims of saving the whales or saving little babies. Whatever that is, that's fine. They shouldn't be directing it to a political candidate who misuse that money and misuse their message. For all those reasons, we're proud to oppose.
I thank Ash for her speech, and to conclude the standing portion of this debate, I welcome Ricky.
Mr. Speaker, Side Affirmative's proposal is against every ideal of the founding fathers of America, where the power of governance will always override the power of the people. To give all the power to influence politics and political and policies that ensure from that to corporations that have ultimately more money than any of these organizations that they talk about. I'm going to answer two questions in my speech today. Number one, whether or not these organizations actually have this extravagant influence in politics. And secondly, what are the consequences to censoring these groups, right? But firstly, I'd like to point out that nobody on that side dealt with any of my first speaker's arguments when he talked about the importance of allowing groups the freedom to express and the freedom to influence policies. Because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, these organizations are deemed successful or are deemed important by communities that they're supposed to support when they help those communities get what they want. When you are a religious organization and you fight for Islamic rights, for example, within America, that's what leads to more people donating to your organization or more people supporting you. If these organizations can't do anything to help these communities in the first place, then how on earth are we going to ever have any organization that would actually help people, ladies and gentlemen? They never dealt with the importance of giving these organizations tax-exempt status. But I'll talk about that right now. Right? First question, do these organizations with tax-exempt statuses have an unfair advantage in influencing the political calculus? Side Affirmative gave us three reasons for this. Firstly, tax-exempt groups have astronomical levels of profit, therefore having a premium standing, causing other organizations to stand subservient to them. Second, they told you that these groups have political leverage and then suddenly swing America into a right-wing country where we'll have anti-abortion laws and nationalistic policies over the national electorate and state government. And thirdly, they told you that instead of trying to influence politics, why don't we just put ads in the newspaper? We have a few responses to this. Number one, we assert that we refuse to accept their assertion, right from my first speaker, that these organizations actually have that much power over government. Because they don't, right, possess extravagant rates of profit. These groups usually rely on donations from individuals and communities which they represent, which can never match profit-based MNCs. That's why all oil corporations will always be stronger and richer than conservationist NGOs. That's why pharmaceutical corporations will always be stronger than health groups that propagate communal health policies instead. Because you don't make profit out of saving a tree, ladies and gentlemen, or you don't make profit from helping a man who's just lost his wife accept the Savior, Jesus Christ. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, The difference, and this is the reason why we gave them tax-exempt status in the first place. Government recognizes that tax-exempt groups not only engage with government, but transgresses into committing social good. That's why we don't give oil corporations tax-exempt status. Because the government recognizes that it's deeply important that organizations that help government or assist government to help minorities or religious minorities, ladies and gentlemen, should be given some sort of reward for doing this. And we think that their proposal asks these organizations to make a decision based on an ultimatum. Number one, help people, or number two, help politics, because you can't do both. Then we ask them the question, right? How does this make democracy any better? How is it that when you censor minority groups, like the American Center for Islamic Development, right? How do you force how do these minorities ever get represented within government? If you ask, if their idea was to, just put ads in the paper and then hope these people will vote for a candidate that actually, wants to fight for Islamic rights. If there aren't any candidates that are aware of Islamic rights, ladies and gentlemen, these are groups that go to candidates and tell them, look, these are the problems that we have, these are the problems that we'd like you to help us solve, right? We also provided you two mechanisms of counterbalance to all the harms, to deter all the harms that they talked about. We have, number one, government audits, right? To ensure that, number one, this money goes towards that social good, otherwise they won't get the tax-exempt status in the first place. And number two, that these groups don't misuse or embezzle these kind of funds. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, that when you have research groups, when the government audits research groups that they found to have been taken over by the big tobacco companies, for example, they remove all these tax-exempt statuses because they recognize that this group isn't actually fighting for social good, that they've been bought over. Secondly, we told you, and from my first speaker speech, that we have something called an election, right? If you have a political candidate that is seen to have been bought over by an oil corporation or bought over by a Jewish lobby group, for example, and the people necessarily aren't too happy with that, I wouldn't be happy with that, right? We think that there's always that check and balance, that people can make decisions with informed choices. That's why we trust the American electorate with the ideals of democracy. We think, ladies and gentlemen, by taking away tax-exempt statuses from these organizations, that you disallow them, number one, to be independent. You take away that ability for the money that you wanted to go back to the people, because right now what happens is that these organizations will now look for corporate funding instead. So none of this money is ever going to get to the people, because these organizations recognize that they no longer need to help people in order to get money, that all they need to do is just to ask a corporation, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that it's greatly harmful. But they also never dealt with the second question that in this debate. What are the consequences of this proposal? Then they asserted two things, right? Political system becomes tilted towards the ideals of this group. Secondly, more people receive of the organization's money. Then they completely ignored what my second speaker told you. He said no. The problem in America, ladies and gentlemen, is that the government is, the power of corporations, like pharmaceutical corporations, big tobacco, is far quickly overriding the ability of people to voice out their own opinions. That when you stop allowing these people to voice out opinions, you push these minority groups away. If the American Center for Islamic Advancement can no longer tell the government that it's important that you help us with Islamic rights, then you're pushing these Islamic groups away from governments, isolating them away from society, and forcing them more extreme measures to find ways to influence government, ladies and gentlemen. That's the first thing. Secondly, we told you that a far number of these communities are going to be harmed, because what you basically force these, because these organizations or these NGOs no longer become independent, you now force them, you take away the responsibility that came with the tax-exempt statuses, and now force them to find for corporate funding. And we think that's greatly harmful as well. At the end of this debate, ladies and gentlemen, this motion, or what side affirmative set out to do, was to set out to find an equal playing field for democracy, to allow the American people informed choices to vote, not based on money, but based on choice, right? We told you, and we took that burden and we showed you how that doesn't happen. Because by taking away tax-exempt statuses, number one, you allow corporations that are more profit-based, that don't give back or don't represent the needs of the people, to override government. Secondly, we told you that you make these organizations less independent. Thirdly, we told you that you push minorities into more extreme measures to get their voices heard. If you really want a better democracy, ladies and gentlemen, then you should side with negative. Thank you.
That concludes the standing portion of the debate, and I will come back to Rick for the negative reply.
Mr. Speaker, side affirmative did not fundamentally mischaracterize this debate, but they did miss a few important parts in it. Namely, what role do these organizations have? They did not deal with the stance coming from negative, in that it harms democracy and it harms society, or removing tax exempt status from these organizations. Right? Let's look at the case that came from side affirmative. They would tax these organizations. They never said how much, and we questioned them from the very beginning how much they tax these organizations. We said that they probably tax them as much as corporations. That was an essential part that side affirmative missed out, because when we brought up this idea of leveling the playing field, Mr. Speaker, and showing you how in America corporations have a huge influence over elections, something that they also seem to accept, how this levels the playing field in favor of these NGOs in balancing it out and competing for lobby groups, right?
Yes.
That was a major part that we messed up. But we think what's fundamentally more important is the values that side negative stood for. We showed you 4 inherent harms of the affirmative speech. Firstly, that it limits free speech, Mr. Speaker. Look, side affirmative seems to think that influence is a bad thing, Mr. Speaker. We said no from side negative. We never said it's a bad thing. But even if there were harms, Mr. Speaker, we showed you that there are mechanisms in status quo to mitigate those harms, namely transparency and audits, Mr. Speaker, to prevent these NGOs from misusing the money in the first place, Mr. Speaker. And we think they basically failed to show us why influence in elections is such a bad thing in the first place. Or even if, under their proposal, corporations now have more power, why that's better for democracy.
Yes.
Second of all, we showed you that it reduces the effectiveness of these NGOs in providing social services, but also their independence of funding, which is something that's crucial for these organizations to continue to serve the groups that they represent, Mr. Speaker. Right? Realistically, we showed you that these organizations have to do both to be effective. They need to both provide social services and also lobby political groups or candidates in order to push for policies that favor the groups they represent. And that was the third piece of analysis that was missed up by side affirmative. That this removes representation of minority groups, given that these NGOs are the best way for these minority groups to reach out and influence government in order to prevent discrimination against them, Mr. Speaker. But lastly is this idea that the analysis that came in affirmative about how this would tilt the playing field in favor of corporations, Mr. Speaker, how the status quo helps NGOs to compete in lobbying. They said that was the engagement to their analysis, that it's unfair that tax exemptions are granted just because we have certain beliefs. That was never the analysis, that was never the reason why we grant them tax exempt status. We brought to you the analysis that they were given this tax exempt status because they fulfill and they complement government in providing social services that the government cannot. The government cannot fully monitor regulations, cannot fully monitor compliance and environmental regulations. The Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, all these other conservation groups help government do that. They also raise awareness that the government needs in order to push these policies and make them far more effective, Mr. Speaker, and that's the role that these NGOs face. We also showed you how these groups provide welfare and counseling for people that the government cannot reach out to, Mr. Speaker. So simply on the assumption that influence is a bad thing, we didn't say it was, but we said that even if it was harmful, we would have ways of dealing with it. Simply on that, they're willing to have all these harms done, not only towards free speech, but also towards people. We showed you that NGOs are far more representative of people's interests, including minorities, any more than corporations or anything that they fight for within side affirmative. For those reasons, Mr. Speaker, side negative is proud to take this debate.
Finally, to conclude the debate, I will go back to the executive.
was never that whether or not you allow these groups to influence elections or not. The affirmative team clearly set up from the start was whether or not tax exemption and the goals that we have when we grant tax exemption and the goals that these institutions should report actually line up with funding for elections, and whether or not that money should go to pushing campaign messages. More importantly, candidates and other campaign messages not necessarily aligned with what that group wants. There were two main questions at the end of this debate, the main areas. How should that money or tax exemption be used? And secondly, does this actually restrict freedom of speech? The affirmative team were very clear from the start. Tax exemption is there, and something government grants to specific organisations to ensure, for example, to ensure that group can meet its inherent aims. So, for example, we gave it to religious groups to ensure that individuals could engage with that religion without, say, a church falling through. We gave it to charities to ensure the money that a charity collects to, say, feed the poor or save the whales actually goes towards feeding the poor and saving the whales. The affirmative team really liked whales in this debate. But more importantly, we told you that when a group wants to push a political message or a political candidate, when they want to put flyers out there, TV ads, radio, that group should be paying money back into the system, back to the government, because that's how we should judge whether, that's how we should level the playing field in this debate. The negative team said that these groups need tax exemption to ensure that they can actually push this message to government. In essence, it was a utility, like a case-by-case system, that because these groups had less money, they should have tax exempt status to further their own message. We wondered why the government, so further their own aims. We wondered why the government, when the negative team inherently said that these groups were fulfilling areas government couldn't, why the government taking less money in tax actually furthered those aims. But more importantly, we told you that it still gives these groups a 20 to 30% advantage for every dollar they have in influencing elections. And a lot of the time, in influencing areas, the money that they collect from their donors may not necessarily want. So you can't just necessarily support one issue for one candidate. You have to support all issues. That's what the affirmative team said. But more importantly, for Tim, we told you that this perverts the funding process, because under the status quo, it is equally as costly to make direct donations as it is to advertise your specific issue. So we're happy with these kind of groups not necessarily funding election campaigns, not necessarily funding candidates, but to focus on their specific issue. We never heard exactly why that they should necessarily have tax exemption to influence the political system in an unfair way. But finally, in terms of this idea of freedom of speech, the negative team said that freedom of speech was highly restricted. These groups would feel oppressed and take more extreme measures. We didn't necessarily think that was a harm in this debate. We should necessarily change or influence how when we grant tax exemption. We were happy to lock up people who were taking it to more extreme measures. But more importantly, the point of this debate was to ensure that if a group wants to influence the political sphere, wants to donate funds to a specific candidate, they should be clearly advertising that by paying tax. When an individual wants to donate to a charity or to a religious group, that money is necessarily going to the cause that individual is donating for. Say, like granting, like building areas to protect specific species and things like that. The more important point is that we want to have a clear line, the affirmative team wanted a clear line of where that funding will actually go and how it would influence that group's decision making. At the end of this debate, we wanted to make it very clear that when large groups have tax exempt status, they have unfair ability to influence the political discourse. We want to have this debate.
I thank all speakers for the debate. I'd like to invite everyone on the floor to shake hands.